Neaco.Cosplay here. I've been cosplaying close to 9 years now, I think, and that is a lot of time to gather a lot of materials. Having a lot of materials at your disposal can be very useful. That is how I've been able to make so many cosplays out of leftover materials. For example, my Dora or my Merlin cosplay. And I even made some videos about some of these costumes, like I did with Princess Bubblegum, Princess Leia, or Pike. Cosplay is a very expensive hobby, so being able to make costumes out of leftover materials and not having to buy new ones is great. So I thought it would be fun to make a video about the materials I like to gather / hoard, and who knows, maybe it can give you some inspiration on what can be useful to keep and what not. So before I dive into that list, I do want to give a few side notes, I guess. First of all, these are the items and materials that I find useful. Everybody cosplays in their own ways. Depending on how you cosplay, you will have different needs of materials. So keep in mind that these are the things I find useful. They will probably not be useful for everybody that cosplays. Second, storing things requires space, and I'm well aware that I'm in the luxury position to have a craft room and have a lot of space to actually store things. Even then, I do think having an efficient storing system helps. I talk a little bit about how I store certain items in my craft room tour, so if you want inspiration on how to store your cosplay stuff, check out that video. And lastly, it's a very delicate balance between keeping useful stuff and hoarding way too much. To protect myself from that last bit, I try to do a big clean out at least once a year, where I go through everything and just throw out stuff I haven't touched in years. I also try to limit the amount of space I'm willing to give to each of these kind of materials, like 2 boxes for wigs, 3 for fabric, 1 for paint. And then there is also the voice of reason, my husband. And all those things sort of seem to work for me most of the time. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into this list. Wigs are definitely the thing I find the most difficult to part with. Basically because I just see way too much potential in them. For starters, a lot of wigs can actually be used for a lot of characters. Yes, they might need some styling or cutting, but not having to buy a new wig for every character is great. Some examples: I have used my Belle wig for Vanessa, I use one of my Astrid wigs for Kristoff, I have used my Daphne wig for my Mitch cosplay, and those are just a few examples. I could probably make an entire video about reusing wigs for cosplay. Maybe I should do that. Another reason I like to keep most of my wigs is that I love doing cost tests. Sometimes I don't want to do a full costume, sometimes I just want to see how the character looks. And I even made a bunch of videos on the whole concept of cost testing. And I also want to do more of those videos, and having a wide variety of wigs makes that a lot easier. And having a few wigs you don't really use anymore is also useful for practicing certain techniques, like cutting a wig or experimenting with a different styling technique or using them for wefts. Like I said, I see way too much potential in wigs. The majority of the cosplays I do require sewing, so it's not weird that after all these years I've built up a pretty decent fabric stash. When it comes to keeping fabric, I do try to follow a few guidelines I set for myself. Any piece of fabric that is at least ½ meter I will keep, because you can do a lot with that amount. Either make a piece for a costume, use it as lining, or even just use it to experiment or as a mock-up. Smaller pieces I will only keep if the fabric was very expensive, or if it's like a special type of fabric like fake fur or fake leather, because even with small pieces of that you can do a lot. The really, really small scraps I will get rid of. I do know that some people also like to keep these, as they can be used as stuffing for certain items. So even with these guidelines, keeping my fabrics within the 3 boxes hasn't really been a problem. There's also been times that I've gave away some pieces of fabric, and I do know that even some secondhand stores take them, but that last option I've actually never needed. I think because I make so many cosplays out of the leftover fabrics that I've managed to contain my stash some bit. Even though most of my crafting is sewing related, I do work with foam and worbla from time to time for certain props or details. And as far as worbla scraps goes, I will always keep those, no matter how big or small. It's actually been a tip that has been given to me by someone else. The reason for that is because you can heat shape worbla, so even with scraps you can do a lot. You can use them for small details or even just put them together and sculpt some things. I, for example, did this with the plant that I made for our Wally and Eve act. And you can also turn these scraps back into sheets. There are many tutorials out there on how to do that. When it comes to foam, I try to keep as much of it as I have space for. And then mostly it will be about pieces that are at least 10 to 10 centimeters, because even with a piece like that you can still make small details. Some of the smaller scraps I will keep in a certain amount because they can be great to glue things, because glue often ruins brushes and foam is a great substitute for that. But most of the time those scraps will just be thrown out because you cannot keep everything. Some packaging like cardboard, styrofoam or even food boxes can make great crafting materials. My husband has used cardboard a lot for props. An example is his cold gun that is mostly made with cardboard and some pieces of foam. I know my friend Goldilocks Cosplay used like a cereal box kind of thing as a base for the Scooby Snacks props that she made. And the quiver for my Gaston cosplay was actually made out of packaging for wine. Of course, you do not need to keep every single piece of packaging. If you consume cereal on a regular basis, you will have a box when you need it. But I will check out packaging to see if I can use it before I throw it out. The things I like to keep at least some amount of are larger pieces of cardboard, larger pieces of styrofoam, or other foam pieces from the packaging. I also like to keep some of these cardboard mailing tubes, as they can be useful for props or just as storage. And then one other thing I sometimes look out for is like harder pieces of plastic, like the one you get when you buy like a Barbie doll and the plastic in front of the box, because that can be useful to use for your props, like when it has a screen or when you need like a small illusion of something floating, like I did with my She-Ra gem. Whenever I want to keep something of these materials, I always do check what I still have, because this is definitely something you can gather way too much of. Then there are a lot of like smaller materials and items that I like to keep that would be way too much to give them all a separate category, so I sort of put them in a miscellaneous group. First thing, when I throw out a cosplay or a piece of clothing that is like too damaged to sell or give away, I will take out the zippers and buttons and all that kind of stuff. Because if they're still in good condition, they are great to reuse. And those can also be very expensive, so not having to buy them a lot is amazing. I also like to keep most of the leftover pieces from ribbons or trims or lace, because those things can also be very expensive, and even just a small amount can sometimes be useful. Something I started gathering more of in the most recent years are decoration things like gems, pearls, flowers, and I don't even know how to call half of this stuff. Some of these things are leftovers from certain projects, And some of these things I just bought when they were on sale, or I found them secondhand, or they were gifted to me. The reason I like to gather these is because sometimes you wanna take some creative liberty with decorating a costume, like I did with Princess Bubblegum. And I've also been getting more into D&D and creating characters for that, and wanting to do cosplays of that, and doing more original characters or own design of characters. And well, I like to decorate stuff, so I like to have options. And then one last thing that is not really crafting related, but I also started to gather small props. For example, potion bottles or books or leaves and flowers and butterflies. The reason I like to have a certain amount of these is because I find them useful for pictures or in videos. Small props can give an extra dimension to your picture or your video. I think it's nice to have some at my disposal. And I think that are sort of the most important items and materials that I like to gather. And I also think that's something that makes cosplaying for a very long time a lot of fun, because you've actually had time to gather all that stuff, and it just gives you so much more options to craft and make things without always having to buy new stuff and thinking about how expensive it's gonna be. Again, these are the things I find useful, so they might not be useful for everybody. Another reminder to try and do regular clear outs so you don't hoard too much, because it can become a problem. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you some inspiration on the things that could be useful. Thank you for watching, and bye!